Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Scrutiny Board for Environment, Housing and Communities for February. My name's Stuart Galton. I am the chair of the board and I'm also a councillor for Rothwell Ward. We will now go round to introduce the other members of the board. Councillor Haig.
Councillor Kate Haig, Labour, Farnley-Wortley.
Luke Farley, Labour Councillor for Bermondsey and Richmond Hill.
Councillor Adrian McCluskey for Farnley and Wortley.
Morning everyone, Councillor Zara Hussain, Roundhay Ward.
Morning everybody, I'm Councillor David Jenkins from Killingbeck and Seacroft Ward.
Councillor Michael Miller, I represent Kippax and Methley Ward and I'm substituting for Councillor Hanan today.
Good morning everyone, Councillor Shaffley from Beeston and Holbeck.
Morning everyone, Councillor Annie Maloney, also Beeston and Holbeck.
Morning, Councillor Lou Cunningham, Armley Ward.
Morning everybody, Councillor Norma Harrington from Wetherby Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Barry Anderson, Adland Wharfdale Ward.
Thanks very much, members. And just a reminder for participants that when you're not speaking, please mute your microphones. We'll now move on to the officers who are supporting us today. I'll first of all look to my right.
Hi, I'm Becky Atherton, Principal Scrutiny Advisor to the board.
And to my left.
Good morning, I'm Nicole Walker and I'll be providing advice to the board today as Head of Legal Services.
Thank you very much. Right, so let's go through the first items on the agenda. Over to Becky. Item 1.
There are no appeals today, Chair.
Item 2.
There are no exclusions.
Item 3.
There are no late items.
Item 4.
Can I ask members of the board to disclose any interest in accordance with Leeds City Council's Code of Conduct? I'll take silence as none, thank you.
Any apologies today, Becky?
We have 2 apologies, Chair, Councillor Iqbal and Councillor Hannan. We have Councillor Jenkins and Councillor Miller attending as substitutes.
Great. Let's move on to the minutes. They've all been distributed to members. Have anybody got any corrections or matters arising from those minutes? No, I think it's worth noting that the proposals for Community Committee review have been published a little later than the date that's in the minutes, but we all have them as members. Let's move on to item number 7, and that's to discuss our work programme. I think it's worth noting, as chair of the Scrutiny Board, that we have found this intervening month particularly difficult as the several original papers for today's agenda were needed to be withdrawn by the departments involved because they felt that they didn't have the time to prepare for those reports. As Scrutiny Board members, we wish to express our concern that that's the case, but we also wish to express our gratitude for those officers that have since brought forward reports to make sure that we have a full agenda today, and also for partners in the third sector who have enabled the third sector report to be produced at the time that was originally scheduled. I understand that other papers have also been withdrawn at short notice from other Scrutiny Board agendas, and given the parity of esteem that is meant to be apparent and employable within the Council's governance structure, I think we need to be discussing that as Scrutiny Board chairs to ensure that we can guarantee capacity within departments to fulfil their requirements to create reports for us so that we can add value to the decision-making process going forward. Any further comments on the work programme as we have it? Councillor Haig.
Yes, I see that for June we have the radon gas testing update on the programme. Is it still something that Scrutiny needs to see?
Well, we did promise that we would have and receive an update as part of that programme. Whether or not it takes a long time to discuss within that agenda is another matter. Any other questions? Councillor McCluskey. We are due to get an update, though. Yeah. Okay, so that's the work programme. Just so for official purposes, we didn't take a vote on the minutes to make sure that we all agreed for them to be accepted. Very good, we have that now. Thank you, Becky. Keeping us on track, governance-wise. So we will take on the next item on the agenda, which is a more substantive item, and that is ensuring the resilience of the third sector. Increasingly, the third sector is playing an ever larger role in delivering services, but also enhancing people's well-being in the city outside of the council's responsibilities. So we wanted to make sure that they had the correct amount of time to celebrate what there is in the third sector, but also, of course, to report back to us what those challenges are, and that we as Scrutiny can make recommendations to support them to do the work that they do. So in attendance this morning, we have 3 representatives from the third sector, and we have several officers who are going to be reporting to the report. I'll now pass over to them to introduce themselves to the board members.
Good morning, Pip from Forum Central, Pip Goff. So Forum Central is the umbrella for the health and care third sector. Good to see everyone.
Morning everyone, I'm Hannah Bailey, I'm Chief Officer at Voluntary Action Leeds, so we're the generic infrastructure organisation supporting the voluntary and community sector in the city. Hi, I'm Jo Volpe, I'm Chief Exec at Leeds Older People's Forum. We're a partner of the Forum Central, so we bring the older people's third sector perspective.
Good morning, Samantha Powell, Third Sector and Migration Partnership Manager in the Council.
Morning, Mark Charlton, Head of Community Safeguarding.
Jeff Turnbull, Quality Diversity Inclusion Manager in Safe Stronger Communities.
Morning everybody, Paul Money, Chief Officer in the Safer Stronger Communities team in the Council. I'm here for this paper and also a following paper around community cohesion.
Morning, James Rogers, Director of Communities, Housing and Environment.
Hi, I'm Councillor Mary Harland, representing Kippix and Methley and Cabinet Member for Community Safety, Communities and Customer Services.
Liz Darmin, Head of Locality Partnerships.
Thank you very much. Now, as this is a jointly produced paper, I'm not sure who wishes to lead in the introduction to it. Councillor Harland, do you wish to do so, or hand over to third sector partners?
I think you pretty much summed up what I was going to say in your introduction. So I think I'm sure people are more interested in listening to our guests today than me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Over to Hannah.
Thank you. So hopefully members have had the opportunity to review the report, which has been jointly produced between ourselves as third sector infrastructure representatives and council colleagues, which I think really reflects the partnership working and good relationships that we have. Obviously, we came to see you this time last year. The report is an update on that report and covers a number of ongoing developments in terms of ensuring the resilience of the sector in the city. So that includes the ongoing rollout of the new third sector strategy, which was fairly newly published last time we came to see you. also the volunteering strategy for the city, alongside some really key ongoing pieces of work which seek to give us a picture of the ongoing resilience of the sector. So in particular, that is the cost pressures survey, which colleagues at Forum Central lead on, and the fact that we are currently in the process of producing the next State of the Sector report for 2024. So that's a process that Val and Forum Central, supported by others, undertake on a biannual basis and gives us a really good snapshot into the health of the sector in the city. We had hoped that we might have some headline findings from that work to share with you this morning, but currently there are still too many moving parts for us to be able to give you any kind of headline figures with any degree of confidence in terms of that work. But we're hoping that the headline findings will be available later next month and can share them directly with the scrutiny panel if that's of interest. Just a few other comments from me before I hand over to colleagues. As you'll see from the report, obviously there are ongoing positive developments in the city, but that obviously is against a backdrop of continuing pressures within the sector, reflecting those pressures also felt within the public sector. So I suppose specifically increasing need and complexity within our communities, rising costs for third sector organisations, and the cost of giving crisis alongside the cost of living crisis. Obviously the impact of the financial pressures that are felt by local authority and NHS colleagues, and the impact that that has on groups and organisations receiving investment from those partners. And I suppose crucially, probably the biggest pressure is the change to employers' national insurance contributions announced in the autumn, and the impact that that will have on third sector organisations across the city. So just to, I guess, round off my opening remarks then, we do feel that there are ongoing opportunities against the backdrop of some of these challenges. So we know that there are new developments nationally, which from a local perspective, third sector will play a really key role within. So particularly the Neighbourhood Health Service and new thinking around those models. Within the city, there's a significant interest and shift, I think, in terms of community power. So obviously the Best City Ambition talks about community power, and we've got ongoing work across the sector supported by public sector partners in terms of really listening to our communities and deep listening within communities. And we feel from a sector perspective, and we know that public sector colleagues are of a similar mind, that there are some opportunities around social value that we feel we could be more effectively realising through a greater coordinated approach across the city. So they're my kind of opening introductions to the report. I know colleagues have got, with their specialisms, perhaps more specifics that they can now bring into the conversation, but I'll pause there in case there are any specific questions from that intro. And if not, I will hand across to Pip or Joe to come in.
Any questions, members, so far? Or do you want to hear more? Over to you. Oh, sorry, Councillor Haigh.
Yes, thank you for that. That's a really good introduction. But you mentioned social value, and it's talked about in the report as having a definition that has been agreed, but I don't see that definition in the report. Could you tell us more about what the definition of social value is in terms of this report, please?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Hay. So social value was included in the third sector strategy as a priority when that was published in late 2023. There's been ongoing work over the last year to bring both third sector partners, but public sector and business sector partners together to really explore that in more detail. So we had a social value roundtable in the autumn, and there have been a series of working groups around particular themes that have then met in order to continue the work and thinking around that. In terms of that broad definition, I can't cite it off the top of my head, but it can be shared following the panel meeting. I think it is safe to say, though, that there are differing interpretations of social value, and I think we've still got some further work to do to really ensure that collectively we've got a vision for the city that supports us to use the opportunities available through social value to support communities in the city and recognises the roles of different sectors within that. So happy to share further information following this meeting.
Just for clarification, I think a lot of people might not know what social value is in how it's used in the sector. Is this to do with private sector policy in terms of what used to be called CSR?
Yes, that's one aspect of it. I think it is quite multifaceted, and that's why I say people have differing interpretations of it. But from our perspective as third sector, it is about what are the opportunities in terms of ensuring that organisations, contractors, businesses that are operating in the city are able to form relationships, whether that is in terms of investment of time, with third sector organisations across the city in an equitable way that then has a positive impact on communities.
Thank you very much. No more questions for the initial introduction. Over to partners.
Thanks, Councillor. So I just really wanted to pull out the maintenance of funding into the third sector from the council, and the fact that as infrastructure organisations we enable a lot of that funding that comes through us to go to smaller grassroots organisations. And as infrastructure, I think that does, as infrastructure third sector, I think that helps sort of your commissioners in the council to do some of that support to the sector. We welcome the fact that with the new settlements to local authority that offered reprieve to some older people's organisations. So really, as a Leeds Older People's Forum, wanted to say that. We do see as third sector infrastructure that we've got huge value within the city, and we've been doing a review with partners to look at our value as third sector infrastructure. So I just wanted to pull out that role that we play, and I don't know if Pip wants to add in.
Thank you. I also just wanted to draw some points out about the kind of Leeds third sector and how we're working collectively with city partners to make sure that Leeds' voice is helping influence some of the national policy, because we recognise that Leeds, has had huge challenges maintaining funding to the third sector, as so many places across the country have. And we particularly do appreciate the continued investment into infrastructure and the way that the partnership and the relationship through the third sector partnership has both sort of strengthened relationship with between the local authority and the third sector, but has also drawn health and other partners across the city into some of those really important conversations around neighbourhood health, as Hannah has mentioned. So that's a key national priority around the shift into community, the shift to prevention, alongside the shift to from analogue to digital. So the third sector has got a lot, along with other partners, to add to that whole agenda. And we've already touched on the importance of community power and recognising the third sector contribution to that. But as part of that work, we're working with the Health and Care Hub, trying to influence National Department for Health and Social Care. People often forget that it's a department for both, to make sure that the value of working with local communities and local organisations in that space is really sort of seen and valued. So we've done a lot around that sort of city partnership on commissioning and funding, including learning around UK SPF funding, which is helpfully influencing some very live conversations I've been having just this morning actually around work and health. That's one significant area where there is some resource coming, and we need to make sure we're building on that third sector capacity around that area. When you were talking about social value, obviously the big city anchors have an important role around employment, and employing people from communities, particularly those experiencing some of the greatest inequalities, is going to be a significant way that we can move on that. And we've done a lot of work around workforce, both in terms of sharing resources with our third sector, particularly some of the smaller and emerging organisations in the city, so that we're benefiting from that sort of health and care workforce resource that we're seeing. And things like the Leeds Community Anchor listening exercise, asset-based community development work is very much feeding into that. So I think we've got, you know, absolutely, as Hannah says, it's been an incredibly busy year. It doesn't feel like a whole year since we were here because it's gone quickly. We've had so many ongoing challenges and we're absolutely continuing to face those challenges together. The third sector shows incredible resilience, actually. I'm forever humbled with how much people show up and turn up and are still willing to be part of the solution when there's so much challenge being faced. But we absolutely have to look at that sort of accumulative impact of all the changes and the decisions and make sure that we're continuing to work collectively to strengthen that third sector and community voice. Thank you.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Councillor Cunningham.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, everyone, for the report. And I'd like to thank the third sector in Leeds and more so in my ward of Armley, because without the input of the third sector, many crucial services would not be being delivered. My question is around volunteer input. I just wonder, how much recognition do you feel is given to the kind of economic value of a volunteer workforce? And how much recognition and how much does that impact the role of the volunteers within Leeds? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Cunningham. So I think this is information that we've covered off through State of the Sector, so the last iteration, and will be covered again this time round in terms of the number of volunteers in the city, and really trying to get an estimate of actually the value that they are bringing in terms of both supporting delivery of services, but also enhancing within communities, bringing communities together and delivering on community priorities and aspirations, you know, working sometimes in partnership with third sector, but sometimes at a very kind of micro level. I know this is an area that more national and regional research has sought to really quantify the impact of volunteering. And, you know, there are some impressive figures in there, but I still think it's probably an underplayed role, and one that obviously as infrastructure we've got a really key role to seek to amplify. So the publication of the volunteering strategy for the city in late 2023 I think marked a really positive step forward in working both within the voluntary sector but also with public sector partners to really create the best environment for volunteering in the city, and really recognising the crucial role that volunteers play across communities. So I think, you know, we've got a lot of strengths in Leeds and a lot to kind of draw from, but still more to do. But the volunteering strategy does give us that strategic framework on which to take that work forward. And crucially, you know, as with the third sector strategy, it's not a strategy that's been developed in isolation within the sector. It is very much about that engagement of a broader range of partners to really recognise the value that volunteering brings.
And perhaps if I could just come in briefly with a very tangible example, because we know we've got about 31,000 volunteers when we last did the State of the Sector. It's a really significant part of our sort of city provision. One of the things that the Health and Care Workforce Academy has done is opened up training and opportunities for volunteers. So very much seeing that volunteering cohort that we have in the city as part of our valued workforce has enabled training and access to support. So some of those kind of very tangible examples of where we've been able to open up training and opportunities, which in turn can be an important part of that kind of pathway into communities, building assets and, you know, employment where that's appropriate, but not necessarily, you know, we just get so much from having volunteers, don't we, week in, week out.
Can I just add to that as well, just Pip's points of reminded me as well of another kind of good example of work that's ongoing with the University of Leeds around a standard suite of volunteer induction and training materials, which obviously supports smaller groups and organisations working with volunteers in their volunteer management practices. And as part of the strategy as well, we're also looking at volunteer passporting, so making it easier for different groups and organisations for volunteers to move between different groups and organisations and really create that very vibrant environment in which volunteering can thrive in the city.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think sometimes people forget that volunteering isn't a kind of woolly activity, that it is really a significant economic boost to the city and to the communities as well. Thank you.
Councillor Haig.
Thank you. And, it's obviously proven that the third sector, makes an immense contribution to the city and the and many communities within it. But I do have a couple of questions. Do you think that the nature of third sector organisations across the city means that sometimes the approach can be patchy and there are areas of unmet need and want in some communities because there aren't organisations there to fulfil that? And also, obviously the council is doing some asset-based community development work and there are workers doing that. What's your experience of that work and how does that contribute to what the third sector does?
Thank you, Councillor Haig. I think Leeds has got a really strongly developed third sector. Compared to other cities in the country, we've got a lot of locally grown, often quite large. We've got a huge breadth of large and small organisations. But you're right, there have been some areas of less well developed. But I think we've proved, for example, in Seacroft, where previously, certainly sort of 10 or 15 years ago, there was very little third sector activity, but investment through health, actually, through third sector health grants and also through asset-based community development, has really seen LS14 and Seacroft on top and other organisations kind of growing in that area. And I know the local councillor and others councillors have been very supportive of that too. So I think we can give that narrative of how investing in an area can really help people be part of that community and thrive and build that. So I think that's kind of one, and there are other areas in the city that we can give that example, as well as, we also know there are areas where that work still needs to be done. So from our perspective, I think that would be an argument for ongoing investment in the third sector. Just to give an example, I was speaking to a colleague from Touchstone actually the other day who was telling me about some brilliant work that the asset-based community development worker working in Lincoln Green had been able to facilitate and enable activities that actually a third sector organisation itself perhaps wouldn't have done. So I think there are some really good examples where having somebody of that community engaged in that way of working can both make things happen but also then help that link in and be kind of sheltered and grown alongside partner organisations who are bigger. So I think we've got some really good experiences of that and some great examples of where that's been good. And I think the community power conversations that we're taking forward and the link to neighbourhood health is going to be really, really significant over the next year.
Councillor Harrington.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, ladies. One question that kind of leads on from my colleague here is, can we try to put a figure on the monetary contribution that all those voluntary sector agencies actually make to Leeds? Because as an ex-trustee of an organisation in the Outer North East, we know that it was millions of pounds worth a year of activity that we were actually contributing to. So I'd be interested to know what the figure is across the city, if that's possible. You might not be able to tell us today, but maybe you could come back with that figure and say, because there's so many organisations, how many volunteer hours, and we know that we give an awful lot of statistics into the council to sort of prove what we've done with the funding. So there are stats there that we should be able to say, well, you've got that number of delivery outcomes that have been delivered. This is the number of volunteers we've got. These are the number of staff we have. And then you could sort of extrapolate some kind of figure from that and how much it's actually saving the council. So it's almost as if it's an investor save, that if you pay money to that, you're actually going to get a much better benefit for it than the actual cost that you're giving them. And obviously the other issue is that if with all the national insurance and everything else that's going on, that charities are going to find it increasingly difficult, never mind about the fact that they've now had a second reduction in funding. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Harrington. Obviously, we've referenced the State of the Sector report and the ongoing work that's happening to produce the next version. So I think our ability as infrastructure in the city to be able to have some of those figures that really quantify the value of the third sector in its kind of broadest sense is something that we'll definitely be looking at. I think at a West Yorkshire level, in the last couple of years, there's been research undertaken commissioned through the Combined Authority and other partners around the sector across West Yorkshire, and that does include, you know, those figures in terms of the overall contribution, because I think it's, you know, despite the fact we are in the year 2025, I think there are still misconceptions about the sector, and obviously it's huge in its kind of range and scale. And you know, I always say it's everything from multi-million-pound turnover organisations to, you know, a couple of people who've come together in their neighbourhood to make change, and everything in between. But I think that idea of having some of those figures that enables us to talk much more confidently as a city about the value that we bring is something that's a focus for all of our organisations. I think in terms of the savings, I suppose, to the public purse, that's where it's obviously challenging in terms of particularly the very low level and preventative nature of a lot of the work that happens within the sector, and that it's often very difficult to kind of quantify what, you know, from a preventative perspective, what savings might have been made. But I think the opportunity for us to think about in broad terms how we can sort of extrapolate figures that help us to tell that story. So I think the figures are really important, and also the narrative and those kind of real life case studies and examples of how the sector works with communities and the benefit that that has for the whole system in the city. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I mean, just to give the stark figure, so the estimate that we had when we last did the State of the Sector was 325.1 million was that figure. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that compares. But we also know that there are lots of measures around the added value, the sort of additional social value of that investment. And that isn't something we've done previously. But because we collectively, Voluntary Action Leeds and Forum Central are investing through, there's a national tool called MyCake that we're using, and that will give us additional access to information about third sector finance. So really confident that we'll come back with a clearer answer with you.
Just to add, there is work ongoing with Leeds Becker to look at a data set from a health perspective so that we can look at how we feed into the Leeds data model and to look at that sort of prevention. So I think that there feels like there's a lot of work ongoing to do that piece of work.
Thank you. Following on from that, volunteers don't organise themselves, do they? And they usually belong to organisations that require permanent staff to make sure that the money that they have available is spent well and that their primary purpose is delivered. On page 28, you have some key headlines around main financial challenges, which worryingly, you say that 64.7% of your organisations that are represented at third sector have lost or are at risk of losing staff. 14.3% are at risk of closure compared to just 2.2% 2 years previously. And then later on, you talk about how funding is lowering. So we already had our budget discussion as a scrutiny board, which saw potential for third sector contributions from the council coming down. Thankfully, in areas of adult social care, those have now been reversed, but it still doesn't mean that other third sector organisations aren't getting less for their money. I think the umbrella organisations have less money each year from the council to do their work. And then you also mention how you're getting less money from the NHS, which I was under the impression had been given quite a lot of money from the government, and you would have expected perhaps that to be reflected in a higher proportion coming to the third sector partners that work with it. Even organisations like Leeds Community Foundation, which is the charity, the Lord Mayor's charity this year, they're unable to offer the same level of grants for the forthcoming year as they had for the previous year. So it sounds a little bit like a perfect storm for the third sector in terms of its viability. And yet there's an expectation on page 34 with opportunities and challenges that the third sector is expected to deliver yet more services for those organisations. So I wonder, do you feel like you have the ear of those in charge that if they are going to expect for you to step up in the future, there might not be much of you left to step up, and that actually that support might need to start now to enable sustainable organisations to do yet more. And while we're at it, you mentioned the combined authority. We did ask someone from the combined authority to come today because we recognised in your report that you said that was a key area for the third sector to be involved in things like work and health. I wonder if you could update us what progress has been made in terms of the combined authority recognising third sector in each of the 5 constituent authorities and their value. Sorry, that was a very long question, but I was waiting for other members to bring some of those issues up. Actually, if you want to hold that one, Councillor Jenkins also has a comment too.
Yes, so you put me off track a bit. So I'd like to echo what Pip says about We Are Seacroft and the work that's been done by LS14 Trust in particular, and as an exemplar for the rest of the city in many ways. I think we should look at how we ask, what asks there are from the third sector with regard to funding, particularly in the spending review. So we would hope probably that there's a 3-year spending allocation which gives some certainty. I think the uncertainty about the funding, say, for the neighbourhood networks was quite unhelpful in many ways, but obviously the council had no alternatives, probably. But so I just wonder if there's issues around how we cope with the cost of living crisis, there's going to be increases in energy bills, water bills and so on, and the inflation possibly is going up as well. So the third sector has an important role, I think, in dealing with that. And speaking as chair of the age-friendly board, I just wondered whether we could assist as a scrutiny board with the campaign for a commissioner for older people, and what your comments are on that. Thank you.
Shall I come in on the Older People's Commissioner point of view? We have as a city, well, as Leeds Older People's Forum and with Councillor Jenkins, supported the national campaign for an Older People's Commissioner because at national government, issues affecting older people don't come under one particular department, and I guess that is reflected in local and regional government. So I would say, as well as an Older People's Commissioner nationally, it would be, I'd really welcome the opportunity of an ageing hub within West Yorkshire, like they do have in Greater Manchester. So that would be, if anybody could support my wish for that, would be welcome.
Sorry, just to go back specifically, what does that support look like that you would like to have that we might be able to recommend?
I think it would be good to hear from, I know we don't always like to hear from colleagues in Greater Manchester, but they've had an ageing hub in their combined authority for many years, and it has put ageing on the agenda on housing, transport, a lot of like really key issues that affect older people. So I guess it's conversations with the mayor and with colleagues in Wicker to say, you know, we're an ageing population across the region and you could support this kind of work.
If I can come in on the sort of range of questions that came through, and then I'm sure Pip will come in as well. I suppose in terms of the overall financial pressure on the sector, I think it is as significant as it has ever been. So there has never been a more challenging time within the voluntary and community sector, and obviously we always seek to recognise that that's also reflected in challenging times within the public sector. But, you know, it is significant. So coming back to the employers' national insurance contributions increase, speaking on behalf of my own organisation, so for Voluntary Action Leeds, that adds £25,000 to our salary bill for next year. And obviously organisations have some options open to them about how they meet that shortfall. But obviously, ultimately, it comes out of an organisation's reserves, which therefore impacts on its, you know, ongoing sustainability as an organisation. And there are other figures within key organisations in the city. So a key organisation delivering citywide, they've estimated it's 160,000 to their salary bill. So I think in terms of our relationships as third sector with our statutory partners, as we've heard this morning and as we see referenced in the report, there are strong relationships. We've got strategies in place. We know that within key strategic documents that the role of and value of the voluntary sector is referenced. I suppose the challenge for us is the importance of taking that systems approach to how institutions respond to these challenges and provide that support to the voluntary and community sector. And we're calling for there to be consistency in that approach rather than it being, you know, sort of directorate by directorate. And I suppose the strength of our relationships gives us the opportunity to kind of have those difficult and challenging conversations. We know through the local government finance settlement that local authorities, you know, have received additional funding to recognise the impact in terms of the increase in employers' national insurance on their own staff. And we've been through third sector partnership and other routes having conversations about what are the options in terms of commissioned providers, you know, providing frontline and essential services within the city and how those organisations respond to that budgetary pressure, particularly given that obviously the resilience of the third sector is cited within the council's corporate risk register. And I think, you know, that resilience, despite, you know, the strength that we see within the sector, you know, it is very, very challenging times. I might actually just one last point before I pause on that one. We know that the local authority and also the combined authority have offered to include within your submissions to the comprehensive spending review a reflection on you know, the challenging environment for voluntary and community sector providers as a result of that national insurance contributions raised, which is welcomed. So I'm going to pause there and let Pip come in.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on your question about health. You will have seen in your pack that there's some really positive work that the ICB have been doing, building on the Leeds third sector strategy to think about what that means. There was a really positive follow-up meeting with ICB and third sector colleagues in February. We have had some strong public statements around support to try and ensure we have parity for the third sector with some uplift. So we have nothing tangible yet to say about that, but we know that ICB colleagues are working very hard to have that parity of uplift wherever possible, and it would be really good if the local authority could look at that and think about that too. We know the general direction. So, for example, Marmot, all of the intention around being bold and scaling up and investing differently. You know, it comes back to that Toulouse councillor's question about volunteering and previous discussion about social value. We absolutely know the direction is supportive of so much of what we're doing, and I think it's partly that keeps us going. It's that sort of sense that things are incredibly difficult, but we know that we are trying to address challenges together. I think it's testament to the really tireless work of so many people in the city that we have seen organisations either continuing but also stepping back and being bold and honest to say where things aren't sustainable anymore, and having the sort of safety and support from statutory and other partners to have those very difficult conversations is really important. But mainly we see people working differently. We see people continuing to rise to the challenge, and you know, long may that continue. But thank you for really noticing that, Councillor Galton. I think we absolutely have the most incredible challenges, you know, and on top of austerity and coming out of COVID and all of those other things that we see. But we know that Leeds has the strong partnership, and we know that if we can get things right, then hopefully we can influence the national policy and the other things that will really make things more sustainable going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Haigh.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up from there. It's clear to me that, you know, and obviously within local government we are very, very familiar with what financial challenges look and feel like and how uncomfortable they are. But Leeds does have a really strong commitment, and I don't want to say, and continues to extensively fund the third sector, which is absolutely the positive and right thing to do. But, you know, you look around the country, that's not the pattern elsewhere. So I think it's a real credit to, and I hope you would agree, Leeds City Council, that we continue to do that. But also, isn't one of the strengths and benefits of the third sector, you know, the access to volunteers, the access to other sources of funding, and is there something perhaps we could be doing to support that work further, which makes you more resilient and our partnership stronger?
And before you answer that, I'll bring in Councillor McCluskey as well.
Thank you, Chair. It was a slightly different tact, and my question was just on the introduction you mentioned about the switch from analogue to digital, and I wonder how that's going, and given the breadth of the third sector, how that's able to communicate with each other. I just know from implementing digital systems in NHS, between NHS and social care, what a nightmare it was, because that can raise efficiencies. I was just wondering how that was going. Thank you.
Yes, shall I just come in briefly on digital? You're right, it is a difficult area, and I think there's lots in that. Obviously, there's a whole area around digital exclusion of communities and of workforce, but there's also that sort of interoperability, that ability of different parts of the system to work together. We have a new digital lead for the city, and we're hoping that there's a kind of reinvigoration of conversations around that, because from a third sector perspective we've done a lot in the past to try and make sure that we have got systems in place, and we often end up with workarounds for particular areas rather than have an overall solution. But we've continued to battle on that front, and we'll make sure that we do that. We can bring a more detailed update on that if that would be helpful.
There are small sort of pockets of work happening around trying to develop a record that moves with somebody from hospital into Leeds Community Healthcare, the active care record they're calling it. So it's very much sort of a read, not necessarily read to write version at the moment, but there is ongoing work looking at how sort of information can pass between clinicians so that people aren't repeating their stories again, but it is in the sort of formative times.
And I think it's worth noting at both a community and third sector organisational level, there's been some good work with colleagues from 100% Digital in terms of supporting communities with digital access and supporting organisations and community venues with access to digital equipment. So Vala doing some work at the minute with 100% Digital around digital capability within community centres, and I know Leeds Older People's Forum are hosting are doing similar work. So there are pockets of, you know, some really good practice and relationships there.
And Councillor Haig's question?
Yes, so in terms of what, I think the question, sorry, there have been a lot of questions this morning. So the question was around how the local authority can perhaps continue to work more effectively to create those right conditions for the third sector to thrive. No.
How we can support bringing
No, what I was saying was that the third sector has other ways in which it can thrive that are not entirely dependent on the council, but also what can we do to help you in those areas?
Yeah, apologies. So yeah, I think you're right to point out that obviously the third sector is large in the city. There are some, you know, organisations that are working to provide commissioned services, but also we've got a whole range of much smaller groups and organisations and emerging groups and organisations. So I think through infrastructure, we support to bring people together, groups and organisations together in networks on a thematic and sometimes geographical basis to enable collaboration to happen at a local and thematic level. And I think the support of local authority and health colleagues in those efforts to bring additional funding into the city. And I think that recognition of the role that the sector does play, I suppose it comes back to additional points that have been made this morning about really recognising the value of the sector. And I think as Pip has reflected, we have got a very diverse and thriving sector in the city. And I think in terms of the relationships between the sector and the public sector, you know, we've really developed in Leeds beyond that sort of, well, the voluntary sector needs funding from the public sector. Yes, you know, some of us are in receipt of public sector investment, and that's really important. But also, I mean, as Pip has reflected, the sort of energy, the creativity that's shown within organisations to, you know, be able to draw in investment from varied sources never fails to, you know, amaze us. And I think there is a role for the public sector to play in creating the right conditions for groups and organisations to thrive in communities and come together in communities. But yeah, I don't know if you've got anything further you want to add, Pip or Joe.
I think one opportunity for support to one another, I think, as different sectors, is how we use our estates together a little bit more effectively. You know, we have a strategic estates board in the city that is looking at this very thing as different parts of the system are releasing their estate asset. How can we potentially co-locate for mutual benefit? And you know, that all that kind of needs to be worked through. But I think that, you know, it's not just about money, there's different enablers that we need to think about, and thought is going into that.
And just finally, I think it is about that sort of shift to trusting the third sector to work as an equal partner. We're seeing that, for example, in mental health transformation, where we're seeing provider alliance development, and we're seeing that kind of shift away from traditional commissioner, provider, deliverer organisations into a whole different partnership space. And that's the kind of, we need to create that very different culture. And I think, again, we've got learning from Bradford and other places locally as to how we can do that, as well as building on some of the really good pockets of work we've already got in Leeds.
Great. Did you want to come in there, Councillor Harlan, to round up the discussion?
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to Pip, Hannah and Joe, not just for today, but for the work that obviously goes on across the city. And I'm sure we all recognise the impact that third sector organisations make in the city, when, of course, we know that need is increasing. But we will face the challenges that we need to and will face together, I think. The third sector partnership is a key player in that. And we'll continue to have the regular and open discussions, and they are open and honest discussions, which is only right. And continue to work collectively for good of not just the third sector but across the city. And we'll continue to lobby when and where we can. But yeah, continue our support for the third sector in Leeds.
Thank you very much. And I just draw the attention of members to there is a recommendation in the paper, which is to note the paper and to make recommendations, but we haven't actually articulated those today, but we can continue thinking about it going forward. And thank you for your time and the richness of the report, and we look forward to the ultimately published review that you mentioned earlier. Thank you very much for your attendance. We now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Stronger Leeds strategy, which is about community cohesion in the city. Paul Money is leading on the paper and has already introduced himself. And once other participants are in place, we will ask them to introduce themselves also. We do appreciate that this paper has been brought forward from the time that it was meant to be discussed to make sure that we had a full agenda today, and our gratitude is to officers and to our police colleagues for enabling that to happen. And of course, it's also a very salient subject matter for us in the aftermath of the disturbances that we had not too long ago. Now our guests are comfortable, I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
Apologies, I thought I'd press the right button there. My name is Jonathan Miniff. Good morning, everybody. Chief Inspector for Strategic Partnerships in Leeds.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marion Hussain, and I'm the Community Cohesion Sergeant for Leeds District.
Thanks. Paul, would you like to introduce the paper?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Galton. And whilst you did reference the fact that this paper's come perhaps earlier than we'd anticipated, we still really do welcome the opportunity to have the conversation about social cohesion and to receive feedback in terms of where we are now with the development of this draft strategy. So thank you for finding the time nonetheless for the discussion. I guess just by way of introducing this paper, community cohesion, social cohesion is fundamental to building a city where people in the city feel connected, safe, and involved and included in what's going on. We recognise already a lot of activity ongoing across communities on this already, and there has been for a while, and I think that stood us in some good stead, actually, when perhaps we reflect on issues last summer in certain parts of the country. But we can't be complacent on such a key issue, and we know in many of our communities we do have challenges around cohesion. So what this is about really is about pulling together a citywide strategic focus on cohesion, where lots of that activity that's going on already can feed in and perhaps be better supported, but that we can also think about, despite the challenges that we've already discussed this morning in terms of resourcing and budgets, we can think about what more we could do working together to improve cohesion in the city and mitigate some of the threats that are impacting in our city and many others. We know that we are fortunate enough to work in and reside in a really multicultural city, perhaps as multicultural as any in the region. What we want to develop is more interculturalism in terms of the different people, population groups in our city, and in doing that, support the creation of a more cohesive and resilient city in which community ties actually reduce social tensions in times of crisis in particular, where you know, a more socially cohesive city which enhances the health and well-being as well, reducing things like isolation and division, both with individuals and different families and populations, and also thinking about the opportunity that a more cohesive city brings in terms of a more economically stronger city, because people feel more valued, people feel more engaged, and people feel more likely to contribute to society in general, just referencing back to the discussion we've just had. Key to our approach then will be the development of a 5-year strategy. We expect that strategy to evolve over that 5-year period, and we will focus on strengthening relationships where we can, strengthening participation in city life where we can, help to develop a sense of belonging for people, thinking about those that are in the city already and the new and emerging population groups that we're seeing arrive, and also kind of running right through that, think about the sense of fairness and equality and how that plays out in terms of city life. There's been some extensive consultation already on the strategy. As I've said already, really welcome the opportunity to further explore the issues that the paper references with members. So thank you for the opportunity to just provide that context.
Thanks, Paul. Councillor Farley.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Paul. I think this is a really important piece of work, representing an inner city ward. You know, whenever I talk about Bermondsey and Richmond Hill, I say I've got the world within my ward, because there are people from, you know, all different sorts of backgrounds and walks of life, and you know, it does make an incredible difference and contribution, having all of these communities. I mean, I always reflect back on kind of the fact that it's always been that way for, you know, 180 years ago. It was my family arriving from Ireland, and you know, some great stories to tell. I suppose my question boils down to what will be the involvement of ward members in this piece of work, not just specifically for Bermondsey and Richmond Hill, but across the wider city. And secondly, how are we going to pick up on some of the good practice that's already taking place within the city? I mean, an example that comes to my mind was around working with the Roma community following the Hare Hills incident back in summer. I know that I've worked with local NHS partners to try and connect them in with parts of the Roma community, looking at how we can you know, look at kind of volunteer programs, helping people sort of like You know, if you arrive in hospital and you don't know what, you know, nobody speaks the language and you're struggling, well, actually, there's an opportunity there for volunteering, and that will then hopefully lead on to kind of, you know, better economic engagement, you know, including work. So, yeah, I suppose, yeah, what's the involvement of elected members, and where can we learn from good practice already? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Councillor Farley. I'll maybe reference both those points and then potentially invite a couple of colleagues to speak. In terms of the member involvement, we have some thoughts with regards to how we might work with members. I've talked about really an evolving approach here, and we recognise already the significant work that members are doing on the cohesion agenda already, often working with council officers and also with third sector organisations, which, as Councillor Cunningham referenced earlier, in terms of Armley, are often the bedrock of local communities. So we very much think there's an opportunity to pick up that work and maybe look to enhance it and increase some capacity around it. We've some thoughts in terms of how we can increase capacity around that work, notwithstanding the financial and resourcing challenges. And we think there's an opportunity within the Community Committee review to look to develop some particular work streams that support this strategy, because actually what this strategy cannot be, it cannot be a strategy that sits on a shelf and there's no meaningful action plan sitting underneath it. So we are thinking very much about what that activity looks like. I'll perhaps invite my colleague Liz just to talk a little bit about the member involvement, and then come back to you on both the learning from our experience and the embedding of good practice, and also thinking about you know, what we learned off the back of the incident in Hare Hills last summer that you were very much involved in terms of the recovery.
Thank you, Paul. So I suppose in terms of the team that I support, the Community Committees team, which supports all of you in one way or another, obviously the issues that happened last year that reverberated across the city, there were some important lessons learned, not least the importance of that local knowledge, both from our local ward members in terms of their knowledge of local communities and how best to work with them and their leadership, but also the valued role that staff that are working with you all in those communities also provide. So one of the things that we've been talking about for some time as part of our discussions as the strategy is being developed is how do we take that knowledge, experience and learning and make sure that that's really embedded in the way that we work at a citywide level. So one of the things that we are looking to do is to create a new post. We've identified some resources to fund that post for a period of time. It is external funding that we've identified, but for a community committee cohesion officer to work with you all across the committee structures citywide to develop local plans that are very much led and driven by what local members and partners feel are very appropriate community committee issues and how we can appropriately address those issues. So at this moment in time, we're just working on a job description, which will have to go through the agreed processes, but that will be additional capacity to support and work with you all and develop locally appropriate responses to the strategy over the forthcoming year and beyond, hopefully.
Just on that matter, before I bring other members in terms of member engagement, the reporting in the recommendation talks about monitoring and evaluating the progress of the strategy through the Safer Leeds Executive, which isn't a public body, and there's no mention of scrutiny. Well, there's no mention of community committees in here either. So if that's a developing story, could we expect that scrutiny will also be included as part of that governance and accountability structure?
Yeah, Councillor Galton, that may be as much to do with the evolving nature of the draft strategy. I think you make a good point. We're thinking in terms of the 5-year strategy that Scrutiny may want to reflect on at least an annual update in terms of progress. It kind of alludes to, and references Councillor Farley's point, I think, about the need, I think, to be more formalised around two things. One is looking back and reflecting on what went well and what didn't go so well, And the incident in Hare Hills is a really good example where we're looking to do that. But also to look forward, back to Liz's point really, and seek to exploit other opportunities to progress this agenda. And I personally think Scrutiny would be a great place to come back, at least annually, to provide a narrative update in terms of what that looking back has done in terms of embedding good practice, and what the looking forward's looking like in terms of what we could do, what's within the art of the possible.
Thank you, that's reassuring. Councillor Haigh.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to pick up on some of the few words in the document about the digital age, because and also what communities are. So, I mean, I think we're very much talking in this document about communities being where people live and the groups of people who live in those locations. But increasingly, I think that people's sense of communities is a commonality with people who are not necessarily closely located with them, but with whom they share interests or characteristics. But also that it's much easier for people outside locations to make interventions into locations through digital means. And, you know, we did see some of that over the summer with the disturbances, especially in Southport. So what can we develop within the strategy that means that we can make challenges where we know there's disinformation, and also when we've got people who are digitally included in that way, WhatsApp groups, Facebook, whatever it is, there's also a community that's digitally excluded from that who don't have that information. So there's quite a broad range of challenges around digital. It can be a huge benefit and a great tool for us to use. And I think we need to understand, and I think especially with younger people, how that works for them, because they're not necessarily talking to people in the street, they're talking to people in America, you know, or anywhere. So how do we have a community focus that takes into account all those challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. It's a really good question, and I think the first thing I would say is that in developing this strategy, you're right. We are thinking a lot about place and about communities in place, but we are also thinking about different population groups so that are not necessarily geographically located in that same neighbourhood or community. And we know that some of those population groups have some particular challenges. It might be about digital, but there are other factors playing in, particularly when we start to think about the equalities angle to this paper. And it's why I kind of referenced it initially. And there's clearly work to do in terms of thinking about how do we best provide that comprehensive support to everybody in the city. And I think that there's opportunities for us to work very closely together. Part of this is around working with elected members, but there's also a broader range of key partners as well, the third sector, and the trusted nature of many of our third sector organisations in communities versus, perhaps, dare I say it, maybe not the same level of trust with some statutory services. I'm thinking very much here about people like me in the council with a particular job title. So I think what we've got to do is to think as flexibly as we can about how we ensure that reach is as comprehensive as it is. Just on that equalities angle, I just wonder whether it'd be helpful for just had a quick chat there with my colleague Jeff, who's kind of working in parallel, really, in support of this and many other agendas, to ensure that we do have that outwardly focused reach as far as we can.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, I very much see this as a golden thread that ties together a lot of the work that we already are doing in partnership with colleagues across, particularly Safe Stronger Communities, but also our third sector colleagues who were here earlier, and other council services, other statutory providers. I suppose one point I would really like to make is, you know, to have cohesive communities, it's a lot easier to do that if communities are willing to do that, if communities are wanting to do that. And one of the ways of encouraging communities to be in that space, I think, where they want to build a cohesive local neighbourhood, they want to build a cohesive city, is to take away some of the barriers like discrimination. So if some of our communities are not feeling that they are getting you know, equality in terms of equality of opportunity in our city as it grows, then that breeds things like resentment, it introduces tensions, and it makes community cohesion so much more difficult. And obviously we see that across the city in terms of people sometimes feeling excluded and pointing the finger at others than groups in their local communities or in the city. So I think equality has a really key role to play in this, in terms of reducing those barriers around discrimination, to provide that landscape to help community cohesion to flourish. And obviously working with agendas like our migration agenda, our third sector agendas, working with our colleagues in localities to help to deliver all of that.
Councillor Haig.
Thank you, that's really helpful. When it comes to work on discrimination, do you think it's really important that we as a council and as councillors are seen to challenge discrimination that might be feeding into our city and say, you know, we don't welcome that here?
Yeah, just maybe just link to that point, Councillor, again, your earlier observation about misinformation and disinformation. I know a lot of that does emanate from social media and online platforms, and I know that if you go back to the conversation we had earlier with Councillor Farley about some of the challenges we experienced in Hare Hills last summer and how we overcame those challenges in the end, it really was, a lot of that was about dealing with misinformation and disinformation. One of the, there's a reference in the developing strategy, but one of the areas of work that we've identified internationally, in this case in Spain, was an approach around anti-rumour activity and tackling that much more dynamically than we have, I guess, traditionally done through our conventional kind of statutory organisation. And I'm thinking here about the council and police colleagues, and I hope they don't mind, but the traditional sort of press departments that sit there providing sort of I think what we need to do is we need to develop our engagement capability online with local communities much quicker than we do already. There are some green shoots, I think, in terms of this work already, but we've got to be on the front foot, I think, in terms of dealing with some of that particularly social media driven I won't say the word I was going to say there, but misinformation that actually is really undermining not only local communities where tons and tons of good work's going on, but also the efforts of the many, including elected members, council officers and others who are working so diligently to ensure that all our communities are places where people can thrive. So that would be an example of something we're looking to do a lot more of. Thank you.
Councillor Harrington.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the information that we've had. It's very useful. I'm just thinking about consultation and how we engage with communities, which follows on from what Paul was just talking about, really. And on page 58, it says that there were 1,472 people engaged with the survey. The population of Leeds in 2022 was 822,483, which actually, I mean, I know you're not taking children into account and all the rest of it, but if you just did a percentage calculation on that, it's 0.18% of the population. That ain't a fat lot of people being engaged with the process. So it's how can we actually make that better? And I think your point you just made, Paul, about social media, we need to be much more active on that and actually get people to correspond to that. I think that also within our neighbourhood policing team, which is absolutely excellent, there is a reticence, and I don't know whether that comes from the top or whether it's just in the local communities, about actually engaging in any way on social media. So I don't know whether that's something that the police press office is saying, no, you shouldn't be doing it, or it's just reticence on the behalf of the officers, but maybe getting more police activity on there to say these are the positives that we're actually doing to work with communities might be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those observations, Councillor Harrington. I maybe respond to the issue around the statistical, I guess, insignificance, you would say, of the survey, and then maybe invite police colleagues to comment on the latter point. I think I wouldn't disagree that 1,500 or thereabouts people who've been engaged is a drop in the ocean in terms of the residential population in Leeds. That survey work has been supported though by focus groups and other community group meetings where we've had the opportunity, principally through our communities team, to engage people around their thoughts. The idea around the survey was really to try just to get a bit of a baseline position in terms of what are the key things that people are talking to us about, that we could have some confidence that, you know what, that sounds right, and those seem to us to be the principles upon which we might want to base this strategic approach. So you'll see that coming off that survey, we are seeing that people think a sense of participation is important, a sense of ensuring that there's relationships across the city is important. That feeling of if people feel like they're part of something bigger in their community, be it a residential community or a population group of another sort, is important. And then that whole thing about equalities and fairness feeding through that. We felt that there was enough credibility in terms of those responses for us to at least start this 5-year strategy and frame some work around, well, if we can work on those 4 key things, we think there's an opportunity to, particularly with communities, we think there's opportunities there. So there has been wider consultation than maybe just a survey, but I would agree with your point. In essence, that's how many people responded to it, but we're comfortable in terms of some of the feedback. I also, in the Chair's brief, had opportunity to talk to Councillor Galton about some academic expertise that we secured from a colleague linked to Leicester and Leeds University, who also provided us with a bit of a steer in terms of the types of questions we should be asking, and also some sense that the feedback we were getting fit with feedback that's been seen in other cities that have commenced some of this work. So I don't wish to dismiss your point, it's a good one, but that was the kind of way we looked at it. And I don't know, John, whether, Maureen, you want to comment on the other point?
Yeah, there's a couple of bits there. Thanks, Councillor Harrington, about for asking that question. I do think there's something perhaps around media training for some of our officers. We've got neighbourhood support officers embedded in all the neighbourhoods, as you'll know. They're ostensibly the ones that are putting out messages on Twitter. They're also using Community Alert, which can be really helpful. And kind of, to some extent, addresses the point that Councillor Haig made around being able to access communities. But I appreciate that although anyone internationally can access our community messenger, actually it's largely for local people. In terms of lifetime incidents, yes, the steer for media is taken centrally, and maybe you're perhaps recognising rightly a disconnect between local policing teams and that kind of central force-led approach. So I think it's a good point and something that we perhaps do need to look at. I think actually, though, it can be really useful, going back to some of the stuff that Councillor Farley mentioned, when I was in BRH, actually media, local comms was a key facet of some of the work that we did. It actually used that media footprint, social messaging, to actually explain to people what we're doing, what our concerns were, and to bring people locally on board were really, really useful, and it really helped give us some traction in some of the difficult areas that we're experiencing at that time. So yeah, I do think there's some work to be done, and you're right to raise it, so thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McCluskey.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up something you said, Jeff, about communities wanting to be cohesive. What do we do when we have communities who don't want to be cohesive? We see the rise of politics of division, both politics on a small p and a large p, and certainly in areas where I live and serve, there is a rise in people wanting division. How do we deal with that?
I mean, I think the paper that you're looking at today is a really, really important part of that. And if you know, you will see the priorities in there, the 4 priorities. Certainly give us a really strong starting point to take that conversation forward. I think it was interesting that you mentioned, you know, some of the divisions. I think I'm going to say, having worked in this field for a very long time, that discrimination exists. Discrimination against our communities does exist, and it is a bad thing. So that's my starting point for the work that I do. We have to acknowledge and take Councillor Harrington's point around social media. There is a large body of people out there, particularly amplified by social media, who don't take that view now. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. There was a relatively general consensus in this country that discrimination was something that happened and that we should do something about it. That's not always the case now. And then going back to Councillor Haig's point earlier as well, I do think that the council has a very strong voice. I do think that, you know, as a democratically led body that provides a huge range of services in all our communities, and obviously you all sit there and work in your communities as elected members, that our voice is really, really important in terms of challenging discrimination and also doing that possibly in the most difficult area, which is social media, because we know it can be a very, very toxic area. But yeah, I would take the view that it's very, very important that we don't allow that approach which has appeared in some parts of social media and some parts of the mainstream media as well, in some parts of our national discourse, to become the preeminent view. I think we have our values as an organisation, and it's really, really important that we stand up for our values, we articulate our values, and we tell people about the work we're doing as well, because we are doing lots of really good work in this city, and it's important for us to tell citizens about that.
Councillor Farley.
Thank you. I suppose just sort of following on from what Jeff said there, I mean, you know, to us ever thus, and I think you know, what we today describe as like the mainstream media has been at this for a long time, in particular newspapers, sewing division. I suppose my question comes down to, I mean, just had a look at kind of the what we will do section, and I suppose the bit that seems to be, dare I say it, missing is how do we engage with the wider population of Leeds. You know, as I said, you know, in my ward, it's very mixed. There's lots of different communities living side by side. We've got community organisations, we've got community leaders, we've got people who are all. But say, you know, how does that relate to somebody, say, you know, living in Kippax? You know, because you know, when you're on the outskirts of the city, you know, your experience of, you know, living in Leeds is very different to, say, if you're living in, you know, the middle of Lincoln Green or in the middle of Armley or, you know, wherever. So it is. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in here, but what's the wider population? Where's their engagement? How do we get them involved? Because ultimately, that engagement is part of the cohesion that's necessary to build, you know, a stronger and better city.
Yeah, it's a good point, Councillor Farley. Kippax is a tricky area, isn't it, to do things in? Only kidding. Yeah, I was just thinking about. And this is part, I think, of our thinking kind of moving forwards about how we do that. But to give you some sense of thinking that's gone on already, and kind of go back to the point about what about these communities that aren't looking necessarily to engage. One of the things we need to do, and one of the things we're really focusing on developing with our colleagues in children and families, is what does the engagement on this subject matter look like in schools? What does it look like in terms of social work and family work? Because we know we've got to start to think about not just the the generation that we're dealing with now, but we're thinking about how the narrative that's playing out in some circles, be it on social media or other media, is really fueling that division that's been alluded to. So there's something for us in terms of working at a really early stage with young people and children in their formative years, and also with families specifically. There's something as well, I think, about lived experience, and we've had some really good success in terms of their pockets of success rather than a systematic way of doing things, but using people who maybe have had things like, far-right extremist views and, been engaged in services or things have happened in their lives where actually they've realised, I don't hold those views anymore, but I know why I did hold those views. And actually, going back to the point of how best do we engage with different communities, it needs a really, really tailored, bespoke approach in some areas. But lived experience is something I think we could use more of, and there's some good examples across the city where we can kind of tap into that. I do think as well, what we need to be thinking about, it goes back to the point Liz made about, I think there needs to be a community cohesion, an interpretation of this strategy in each of the community committee areas at least. Because it would look different in some parts of the city. Dare I say it, the community cohesion approach is just as important in North West Leeds and North East Leeds as it is anywhere else, but it needs to look different and reflect what the community concerns and tensions might be. So we do think working with members and working with the new resource that Liz has talked about and community committees, we can bring this to life. We also think there needs to be a more targeted, intensive piece of work done on cohesion in some of the other parts of the city. So we are thinking about working with third sector organisations that are really well established in certain parts of the city. There's still some work to do in terms of commissioning this, but we think parts of the city require that really intensive focus, and BRH, Gibson and Hare Hills is one such location where we think we need to do something in addition there. But everywhere will benefit from an approach, and I guess we just need to make sure we're as flexible as we can be in terms of tailoring that. I think there is another potential thing coming down the track that might help us with this, Jeff, that you might want to just share.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so I think it's really, really important that equality is something that all communities feel that they have a stake in, and we know that that's not the case at the moment, that the equality, diversity, inclusion agenda is seen as a minority issue or seen as an issue for minorities. The legislation isn't like that at all, obviously. The legislation, for example, on race discrimination is very clear. It prohibits discrimination on anyone's race. And the same for the other protected characteristics as well. There has been something which has potentially undermined that over the last 14, 15 years, which was that the socio-economic duty of the Equality Act was never enacted. And certainly in terms of some of the mood music from the previous administration, they felt that actually that was an area that was missing. And the current administration did have in its manifesto, and we believe it's taking forward, the idea of enacting the socio-economic duty. Timeline-wise, we're being told around 2026 at the moment. Work is ongoing on that. We've been working with colleagues across West Yorkshire and with the Mayor's office to monitor that situation and think about how we pick up the socio-economic duty. But I think it could be really quite transformational in terms of how communities feel about the equality agenda, and a lot bigger buy-in from diverse communities right around the city in all of your wards right across the city if that was to take place. And we're obviously giving great thought to how that could work on the EDI agenda and wider within the organisation.
Councillor Harlan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, Paul's probably covered most of what I wanted to say, but I've got to say that right at the beginning of discussing this strategy, absolutely taking it out to the outer areas like Kippocks was fundamental, because we instinctively think that there are areas that need to be discussing cohesion, but it needs to be everywhere. And it is absolutely at the core of what we need to do. We need to be talking to those people that don't think cohesion affects them, because they're already quite cohesive. Thank you very much. But it is fundamental that we take this across the city, and this new officer, this new post, will be instinctive in bringing that forward, but also with champions from the community committees, and the community committee chairs have got an absolute fundamental part to play in this.
Thank you for that. From my own perspective, one of the things that I think is missing from the strategy is around celebration. We seem to be focusing very much on problems, and there's some very wide-ranging aspects in here in terms of how this cohesion strategy is going to have an effect on things. So, for instance, it mentions green spaces, which is an area that we're scrutinising, but we also know it's an area that doesn't have a lot of money in it. So I'm not expecting that aspect of the strategy to be progressed at pace, unless it could be associated with something else. And one of the things that we can do is, as Team Leeds, and it's mentioned in here, is to celebrate what we have in common as a city. We have a leader who is a cohesive aspect of the city, and they are the Lord Mayor, which is elected every year and is derived from a very diverse councillor population, and has responsibilities to deliver their duties across the entire city and to demonstrate the values that I hope we're all going to live up to. And we also have the opportunity in 2026 for the city to celebrate its 400th anniversary of incorporation, which offers us a chance to come together as a city and celebrate what's best. And I think that, if nothing else, can be a real driver to get cohesive messages delivered citywide. And that might be something that the cohesion officer that you're mentioning might want to pay attention to and work alongside the Lord Mayor to deliver that message, perhaps, because let's face it, party politics can get very divisive, and more so through social media. So to have someone who is specifically there in a leadership function to be non-political and be cohesive is a missed opportunity if we don't take up that. On that, if you don't mind, I'll conclude that report. We have a recommendation, but we're going to amend the recommendation to reflect the discussion that we've had today in terms of that monitoring and evaluating platform, for us to be part of that. Is that okay with members? Thank you very much. Do members like a comfort break before we take the selective licensing for 5 minutes? We'll see you again just gone past. Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to take our last item, well, not quite the last item, but the last substantive item on the agenda, which is on selective licensing. Members will recall that the Council has had 2 licensing schemes which have now finished, and that they have been consulting on creating new licensing schemes in other parts of the city. As part of that discussion, Exec Board requested that the Scrutiny Board would look at those schemes and look at lessons learned to see how any new schemes might be informed by that process. In that discussion at Scrutiny Board, we also suggested that consultation on the proposed scheme should also be included. And that is what we had agreed. And that was the situation that was going to occur up until very recently, where legal advice was given that because that consultation had yet to be concluded in terms of its reporting, then it would not be appropriate for it to appear at scrutiny at this stage, which is disappointing for members because they did wish to have a look at that information. It has now been offered that that information can come to scrutiny again before it goes to Executive Board. However, I have just been informed that the date that Housing is expecting to take this to Executive Board is in April, and we do not have another meeting scheduled before then. So my first question to officers is...
We've got a meeting on the 2nd of April.
Sorry, just a second. We've got a meeting on the 2nd of April?
Yes, so that will be prior to the Executive Board. See?
Right, okay, I beg your pardon. So we can actually get to see it before the board, although we do have a rather large agenda already scheduled for that date. Okay, so there's going to be 2 opportunities on this going forward. And today's discussion is primarily going to be on the past experience of selective licensing which occurred in Beeston and Hare Hills. And we will have questions on lessons learnt from that. And we have also been told that we can refer to the future licensing scheme, but that you might not be able to have the information at hand that we might ask for. And in those circumstances, it can then come forward at a later date. Is that okay? Right. Yeah. Okay, so let's go forward with the introduction to the paper. Who wishes to do that? Councillor Lennox.
Thank you. I'll let officers introduce some of the detail in the paper, but I just wanted to thank Scrutiny for working with us so that this can be discussed today, and thank Becky for all support in getting it here. There's a lot of learning that's come out of these first schemes. It's been part of a lot of work, as referenced in the report, with the Health and Housing Steering Group. It's been part of a lot of work with the Sir Michael Marmot and the IHE. So I'm really grateful that we're able to discuss the learning that we've had over the past 5 years today.
Thank you for that very concise introduction. Gives more time for questions. Who would like to go first? Councillor Anderson.
Oh, I've got a lot of questions, but I'm not, because I really do have a lot of questions in this area. But let's start with just a simple one. Right, we're now being asked at this stage to look back. Why are we looking back now? And that was this not done before the consultation on the new scheme took place, so that we could make sure that whatever recommendations, and there are some positive lessons learned identified here, are reflected in the new scheme. So why are we here today at this date looking backwards when that could have been done some time ago in advance of the new scheme being consulted on?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Ireland. I'm Head of Service for Private Rented Sector at Leeds. We continually look at the lessons learned, councillor, as we go through any process that we do, including selective licensing. The lessons that we've learned are detailed in the report, but we don't actually have a scheme to implement them in because there's no decision being made as to whether or not there's a scheme moving forward. If there is a scheme moving forward, then those lessons will be incorporated into that scheme.
Councillor Anderson, I'm aware that you have lots of questions, but so do other members of the team. So we might need to actually go around and come back to you for further ones. So I'll give you a supplementary now, but then we'll go to other members. Okay?
Report today, we have no commentary at all on value for money on terms of the previous schemes as to whether or not they met the desired targets. They've achieved the number of properties being brought up to acceptable standards, that we've levered in money to help landlords improve the energy efficiency of their properties. There is no values put on how much extra additional police resource was brought in, how much additional health service funding was brought in. Is there a reason why that is not included in here so that we can assess whether or not the previous scheme was or was not value for money?
No, there's no reason why it wasn't included, and if you wish it, I will look to include it in a supplementary report for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Further questions from members of the board? Councillor Haigh.
Thank you. Selective licensing is widely used across the country by a number of councils and is generally considered to be beneficial. Would you say that was the experience of the scheme in Leeds, and not just in improving the housing conditions of the residents affected by the scheme, but also in the wider benefits in terms of dealing with criminal behaviour and also in contacting vulnerable residents and connecting them into support services?
I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned from coming out of the scheme is not around... I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned coming out of the scheme is the level of criminality that we have found. I think if I'd sat in front of Exec Board or Scrutiny Board in 2019 and said I'd find 500 plus cannabis farms in both areas combined, I would have been laughed at. But that is actually the fact. One of the lessons that we have learned is we've changed the way that we work. Operation Braylock is an example of that. I think yourself, Councillor Galton, mentioned Neighbourhood Improvement Board about what have you done different, what's different in terms of the day job. Braylock is an example of that. The intelligence that we've got out of that from selective licensing in terms of criminality has led to a completely different way of working. The police are working differently with us. They have identified this as an issue and a good way of disrupting organised crime in the city. They have put together a team that we work very closely with and other partners that is solely tasked with going and disrupting criminality and cannabis growers in the city, and that's resulted in millions and millions of pounds worth of cannabis being taken out, and that work continues. I have officers going this week. I think they've already done 3 warrants as a result of that way of working.
Just for clarification, I'm assuming you're not saying that those cannabis farms were in any of the rented properties that we were inspecting?
They were found within the private rented sector in both areas, yes.
Thank you for the clarification.
They weren't being rented at the time. They were being lived in by people who were potentially being trafficked, but they weren't rented.
Councillor Farley. Councillor Haigh wants supplementary.
I mean, that's certainly a fascinating insight into one of the side benefits of the scheme that perhaps we didn't anticipate. But I also asked about individual tenants and particularly vulnerable tenants. You mentioned people being trafficked, people who have got mental health issues or issues with lack of income through not claiming benefits. You mentioned in your report that that was also a side benefit of the scheme. Would you like to speak more about that, please?
One of the aims was to cross the threshold and not just address housing conditions, but also to engage with people and try and address needs and bring partners in as a result of that. Not everybody needed support. Some people might need simple things like support to find easel, or might just need something around, for example, how to find an education course. Others, as we've put in the report, had some complex needs that resulted in us working more extensively with partners to address those and to support them. We took out the Institute of Health and Equality's Tammy, who came up to review the city and its approach to Marmot. She was complimentary about what we did, gave us some feedback as to what we think we could do better. One of those is we do need to work better with some partners. We've started those conversations with the NHS, especially around social prescribing and how we could work closely with them. They're at the moment looking at their contracts, and one of the parts that we're looking at with them is how can we get into that contract that they work closer with housing. That will allow us to work better and them to work better, because they have an awful lot of issues that are housing related. And if we can work better together, then we are able to hand over people quicker and get on with doing our role, and they are wasting less time trying to find out which agency they need to speak to in order to remedy the issues they're coming across.
Councillor Farley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mark. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to the PRS team for the incredible work that is done on the Hare Hills and the Beeston selective licensing schemes. It's really important to see how the council is tackling some of the worst housing conditions in the whole city. Some of the casework that has presented to myself, being a councillor representing people in the one of the selective licensing areas, it's absolutely appalling when you see the state of some of the housing that people in this city are having to live in. You wouldn't keep a dog in some of these properties. It's absolutely vile. So I'd just like to start by saying thank you. Secondly, there's a reference in here, but not necessarily in much detail, about the consequences of COVID-19. When the scheme was initially introduced in 2020, obviously it was just before the outbreak of the pandemic. Perhaps you could talk more about how that sort of held back some of the progress that we might have expected in those earlier days, and what may have been done to rectify that.
We obviously did a risk assessment, and one of the risk assessments that we didn't come up with was a pandemic. We obviously had a series of lockdowns, each one slightly differently in terms of what we could and couldn't do. The issue that we obviously had was, firstly, limited access to the office. Secondly, we had a significant number of paper applications at the time which we needed to process, which again was limited. We could only get 2 people in the office at the time. We had to come up with a completely different way of addressing that, so we had to agree with IG how we would take those out of the office, that they would be completed by other people. We had to get 2 people in to iDocs them, to get them onto the computer. Ideally, that would have all been done with 20 people in the office, but we only had 2. First lockdown, we also agreed as a council to support the sector in terms of we didn't chase the fee until the autumn to support the fact that everybody was in had financial issues. The fact that we couldn't chase the fee, or some people chose, some people didn't choose to pay the fee, meant that we couldn't issue the final licence, so we couldn't go out and do the inspections anyway. We were limited to go out and do inspections where we could over those 2 years because of the restrictions that we had. Some you know, where we could, we went out. So in reality, we didn't do what we planned to do really in the first sort of 18 months, 2 years of actually getting out, being proactive, crossing the threshold and getting into properties. We have managed to get into just under 3,000, but the plan was to do every one, but unfortunately that didn't materialise. Sorry, to add to the second part of your question, what did we do to try and improve that? As part of the work that we've done in both areas, we've enhanced the selective licensing team. So we have officers who have supplemented it to go and do additional inspections. We've obviously had the rogue landlord unit that have dealt with some of the criminality, although a lot of that has been dealt with by the team as well. We've used the empty property team has been in there, as mentioned in the paper, and we've also supplemented it with where we've had complaints from people. We've used some of the resources we've had from the reactive team as well.
Thanks, Mark. And I think that's really important context kind of for how this scheme has operated. I'd just like to come on to Councillor Haig raised it, and obviously we've touched on the serious criminality that has been involved in some of these properties. Could you talk more to some of the work that the PRS team and selective licensing team has been doing alongside the police and with LASBAT, tackling some of the social issues that we find in places like Beeston and Hare Hills, and more specifically around the Clear Hold Build programme, in which kind of selective licensing has been a real key element of that in tackling some of the issues in Hare Hills?
I have to be careful what I say because I don't want to give away operational secrets, if you like. The way that it is operated is it's been clear that we have been able to use selective licensing as a tool to target criminals and criminality in the sector. There is a sentencing hearing on the 20th of March for an Operation Base End, which was a case that went to the Crown Court in January this year, and that involved 4 managing agents, 3 of which have been found guilty and are being sentenced on the 20th. That involved a year-long operation involving ourselves and the police. It involved us looking at them, sharing information, using the information that we held to piece together how they operate, how they are interlinked. It culminated in a day, operation day, where we had officers embedded in the actual operation room, sharing information, looking at documentation that was seized, going out on warrants, looking at it to actually create the connections between them. We subsequently provided additional statements and additional information during the court case which was raised as part of that process. Subsequent to that, 3 have pleaded guilty. The other one, the police decided not to pursue for reasons of they'd have to go for a new trial and the evidence, etc., that would be available given the pleas of the other 3. That's just one example of where we've worked differently, and we've worked closer together with the police around issues of criminality. And ironically, The Guardian have just published today an article around managing agents and how they are creating cannabis farms and causing problems. So nothing to do with me. I have no contacts in The Guardian.
Councillor Anderson, did you want to come in with another question?
Just in case anyone has any doubts at all, I'll put my cards on the table here. I actually fully support the selective licensing. I am not against it in principle. I support the objectives of it, and I am lucky with being the shadow that I have been fully briefed on the criminal activities that have taken place and fully appreciate that. However, where my concerns come is in how this is being, the processes involved, the administration costs, and why there isn't clarity on that. I mean, for example, in paragraphs 61, it would have been nice to have had a breakdown as to what those costs were. In terms of paragraph 62, it would be good to set out the reasons why you opted not to have part payments, rather than just saying we decided it wasn't, which is fine. It just puts what was the rationale and the evidence behind it. And I'm also advised that if someone was to say take a property, get a license in year 1 and pay a number of years, that license then covers a period. If they then sell that house in the interim, there is no refund back again. So in other words, they've effectively paid for a service that they're not going to get, and then the new landlord taking over would be expected to pay afresh. So you could end up actually having, in some instances, 2 fees being paid for the same property. Now, I don't know how many properties that covers. I haven't a clue. I'm just basing this on briefings that I've received from landlords and the concerns. So how can we get a breakdown to them of what the costs are in paragraph 61? How can we just get an explanation as to why the conclusions were reached in 62? And in terms of the reasons you say you don't want to do it, what about a refund? How are you going to operate that? Because if it's over 5 years, there may be a turnover of properties, and there may be people who are selling for whatever reason, not just because of selective licensing. Let's be clear, people are not necessarily selling up because of selective licensing. There are other factors as to why they're turning things over. So if we could just, I'll leave it there, but if you could answer those specific issues.
Can I just clarify, part payments, what we spent it on? Refunds, right. Refunds, very clear, the law doesn't allow us to give them. Don't disagree with the fairness or not, but legislation does not allow us to give refunds. You pay for your licence. If you sell your property, we aren't able to give you a refund. In terms of part payments, we considered this as we considered a number of things around the fee. We took advice. You can take part payments if you wish to do that. However, there is a number of issues with that and risks to the council. One, if we issue the licence without a part and someone fails to pay the full licence fee as a result, we can't cancel the licence. We can't say, right, you've not paid the last of your fee, therefore your licence is invalid. There's nothing in the legislation to allow us to do that. So there is a risk to the council that if we do that, that you don't collect the money. There's an additional cost to the council, so you would charge an additional fee for doing that. In terms of the alternative is that if you pay part payments and you don't issue the fee, you delay the inspection regime. So if you allow someone, someone pays today and then 4 weeks later pays again, and we issue the fee, the licence within say 28 days, if someone's paying over 12 months, if we choose not to give them a licence until they've paid for the risk that we don't collect it, we cannot issue the licence and therefore go and inspect the property against the conditions at which that licence is granted.
Could you not offer annual licences instead of having a 5-year licence and thereby space out the payments?
Sorry. I'm not sure that you can, but ultimately, if you do, the licence fee would go up over the 5 years because your collection costs and the issuing of the licence would still have to be done. We did, at the time, whilst we were consulting, there was a case which basically meant we had to charge 2 parts to a licence, and we did look at that. The cost of the actual licence should have been 875, and we only charged 825, which is the fee that we consulted on. If we had decided to go with a 875 fee, we would have had to come back and consult again based on just that fee. We chose not to. We chose to absorb that as a local authority.
So in the report that comes for the April meeting, could we have something a little bit more explicit about the options considered and reasons for not taking them on board? And at the same time, it would be useful to have comparators with other authorities, named authorities, to show what their licence fees are and their payment methods, to demonstrate that we're being consistent. Any more questions from members? Councillor Haigh.
Thank you. My question is to Councillor Lennox. As the Exec Board member, would you say that responsible landlords have nothing to fear from these schemes, and in fact a lot to gain, because it actually means that tenants can be attracted to someone they know is going to be looking after their property and fair in their dealings with them?
Thank you. I would say that. I think that, something to make clear is that Housing Leeds works with landlords across our city in ways far beyond regulating or selective landlord licensing. We work with landlords who massively support the homelessness challenge and challenge that we have for people requiring accommodation. We have good partnerships with landlords who, as I say, support the housing emergency that we face. This is not, this scheme is to do with providing quality and safe accommodation and protecting and supporting people who are finding themselves sometimes at the most vulnerable points of their life, as well as some of the most low-income families and low-income people in the city who live in the areas that we are discussing in this report, and the areas that were consulted upon for any new selective landlord licensing scheme. Leeds works with and relies on landlords. Private rented is a massive part of our housing market and our housing sector, and it has to be safe and it has to work for the communities and for the population of the city who need places to live, so that they can contribute to the city and so that they can live healthy and live lives with their families and with whether that's children or whether that's living with elderly family. We can't expect people we mustn't expect people to live in substandard accommodation. This is not about penalisation. This is not. I'm just paraphrasing some of what I've seen in some discussions about this policy online, and some of what's been put to me in emails. This is not about penalisation or singling out of any particular area or any particular landlords. This is about making our city a safe and healthy place for people to live.
Thank you, and I think it is important to look at the wider picture in terms of Leeds and the lives people live here. I think, with the Chair's indulgence, I'd like to perhaps suggest that we make a recommendation that, based on what we've heard today about the success of this scheme, that we encourage you, as the Exec Board member, to consider implementing a new scheme in the city so that we can get perhaps some wider benefits for more people in the city going forward.
Councillor Anderson.
Just briefly, in the paper you set out the feedback that you've got for the existing, the scheme that's now stopped effectively. It would have been helpful as well if you'd been able to point out where you got the sources of that feedback from, and also if you'd spoken to any tenants to assess what benefits they saw, because hopefully the tenants saw some benefits from the scheme being implemented to you know, you don't necessarily need to give me the answer just now, but maybe when you're bringing back the report the next time, that you reflect back in that based on feedback from the tenants, this is, you know, we've looked in this, we've enhanced it to do this, we've got evidence. It doesn't state very clearly in your report the source of the good things that have been done as to where's the evidence that people can touch, feel and see to prove that we got it right when we did it first time round.
Councillor Lennox.
I think potentially what we may have done, which in hindsight we should possibly have done, is provided as members as an appendix the Executive Board report from early last year when we initially requested permission to go out for consultation for any new scheme, which did include a lot of, as this report does, but did include a lot of case studies and quotes and evidence from tenants who had been contacted as a result of the work that's been going on in the previous schemes. In paragraph 17, it says 6,032 people, I think it says, or 23 people now live in a better quality home as a direct result of the powers that LCC has been given using the selective landlord licensing legislation. And so I think I'll take your point, Councillor Anderson. If we come back and we want to spell out more clearly, anonymity being put in where it needs to be, some more clear case studies, we can do that. But I would also, and as I say, with hindsight, maybe we should have also appendixed the health and housing report, which went through a lot of the work that had been done with the IHE and Tammy Boyce about this, because it has been highly praised as reducing health inequalities in the city, the actions taken by the PRS team as a result of these powers. So I think I would hope that the evidence in the reports does evidence the impact that this has had for people, but I mean, we're always happy to talk more about the impact that this has had, because I think that's clearly why this was brought forward and why we are seeking to look at whether there is scope for a new scheme.
Thanks. As has been referred to previously, I think all members of the board have had a considerable amount of correspondence with people who are concerned about the scheme, primarily, of course, those being landlords. And there were some areas that were mentioned which it would be pertinent, if possible, to report back on when you come with the report on any new scheme that might be confirmed. Yeah? And one of those areas is a concern because at the end of the day, it's supposed to be about delivering better outcomes for people who live in those communities. And one of the concerns from those correspondents is that a licensing scheme has an inflationary effect on rents. So it would be good if there could be some comparative work, because I didn't see it included in this scheme in terms of the what had been evaluated. So it would be good to know whether rent increases in licensed areas were any different to rents in other areas during the same period. And in terms of turnover, I think it's already been referred to as well, whether or not the expectation of a licensing scheme means that landlords feel that they cannot sustain the number of properties that they have, and those properties are therefore sold. Because it was mentioned earlier around how the licence can't be transferred to any new purchaser. So we must already have records of people who have left the licensing scheme. So we should be able to see what ratio of turnover there is as a consequence of the schemes that took place. And that would help, I think, in evaluating what might have happened in some of the new schemes that might come forward. And then the last concern is there was a specific reference, and we have an EDI responsibility on this scrutiny board, there was a specific reference that the consultation that has been out, that's mentioned in the paper here under 83 onwards, was only in English. And given that the licensing areas have a very high diverse population, that this might have discriminated against their participation in that consultation. So it would be good to confirm whether that's the case in any future report.
Can I
Unless you can mention it now. Thank you.
Yeah, if in terms of rent levels, Table 3 shows the average rent levels from 2019, page 94, sorry. Across Hare Hills, Beeston and the Leeds average.
Yes, but yeah, I would suggest a Leeds average doesn't compare apples and apples, because Leeds is a very large city and includes some very rich areas. So it would be good if, for instance, another area that might be considered for future licensing had been used as a comparator for rents. Yeah. Councillor Cunningham.
Thanks, Chair. In addition to the information Chair's asked, I wonder if we could also have some kind of comparative data about the number of the private rented properties that are actually receiving their rent paid via the local authority, as opposed to those people paying their own rent privately. I just think it would help with the kind of whole economic picture going forward. Thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Farley.
Yeah, it was just a quick question with regards to the table on page 94. I just want to clarify if this is correct. That in Hare Hills, a 3-bed property was on average costing less than a 2-bed property in 2019, and because that doesn't look correct to my mind.
I would agree, except that was the data that we had in 2019.
Councillor Jenkins.
First of all, I'd like to second Councillor Haig's recommendation. And next, just to quickly say, paragraph 65, it says 2019 to 2014, as if we're going backwards. It may be a typing error.
Sorry, yeah, I can't time travel. It should say 2009. My apologies.
Any further questions? Okay, so we have a recommendation that's been proposed by Councillor Haig and seconded by Councillor Jenkins that we, if I get the wording right, because Councillor Haig is very precise, that we, on the basis of the results that have been presented to us today on the retrospective schemes in Hare Hills and Beeston, that we would look positively for further licensing schemes to be developed going forward. Is that okay? Great, so that will be added to the recommendations. And that concludes the discussion on that paper. Thank you very much. What is the next item on the agenda? It is the date and time of next meeting, which, if I'd have read, I wouldn't have asked the question earlier. It's going to be on the 2nd of April, on Wednesday at 10:30. Look forward to seeing you for the pre-meeting at 10 o'clock. Thanks for your attendance today.